Heart of Darkness, Part 3. I looked at him, lost in astonishment. There he was before me, in motley, as though he had absconded from a troupe of mimes, enthusiastic, fabulous. His very existence was improbable, inexplicable, and altogether bewildering. He was an insoluble problem. They're talking about the Russian guy here. It was inconceivable how he had existed, how he had succeeded in getting so far, how he had managed to remain, why he did not instantly disappear. I went a little farther, he said, then still a little farther. Till I had gone so far, I don't know how I'll ever get back. Never mind, plenty time, I can manage. You take Kurtz away quick, quick, I tell you. The glamour of youth enveloped his party-colored rags, his destitution, his loneliness, the essential desolation of his futile wanderings. For months, for years, his life hadn't been worth a day's purchase, and there he was, gallantly, thoughtlessly alive, to all appearance indestructible, solely by the virtue of his few years and of his unreflecting audacity. I was seduced into something like admiration, like envy. Glamour urged him on, glamour kept him unscathed. He surely wanted nothing from the wilderness but space to breathe in and to push on through. His need was to exist and to move onwards at the greatest possible risk and with a maximum of privation. If the absolutely pure, uncalculating, unpractical spirit of adventure had ever ruled a human being, it ruled this bepatched youth. I almost envied him the possession of this modest and clear flame. It seemed to have consumed all thought of self so completely that even while he was talking to you, he forgot that it was he, the man before your eyes, who had gone through these things. I did not envy him his devotion to Kurtz, though. He had not meditated over it. It came to him, and he accepted it with a sort of eager fatalism. I must say that to me it appeared about the most dangerous thing in every way he had come upon so far. They had come together unavoidably, like two ships becalmed near each other and lay rubbing sides at last. I suppose Kurtz wanted an audience, because on a certain occasion, when encamped in the forest, they had talked all night, or more probably Kurtz had talked. We talked of everything, he said, quite transported at the recollection. I forgot there was such a thing as sleep. The night did not seem to last an hour. Everything. Everything. Of love, too. Ah, he talked to you of love, I said, much amused. It isn't what you think, he cried, almost passionately. It was in general. He made me see things. Things. Okay, so number 1, what is unusual about the man who greets Marlowe's boat is that he survived so long, all alone in the wilderness. And number 2, how does he feel about Kurtz? He seems pretty devoted to him. He threw his arms up. We were on deck at the time, and the headman of my woodcutters, lounging nearby, turned upon him his heavy and glittering eyes. I looked around, and I don't know why, but I assure you that never, never before did this land, this river, this jungle, the very arch of this blazing sky, appear to me so hopeless and so dark, so impenetrable to human thought, so pitiless to human weakness. And ever since you have been with him, of course, I said? On the contrary, it appears their intercourse had been very much broken by various causes. He had, as he informed me proudly, managed to nurse Kurtz through 2 illnesses. He alluded to it as you would some risky feat. But as a rule, Kurtz wandered alone, far in the depths of the forest. Very often, coming to the station, I had to wait days and days before he would turn up, he said. Ah, it was worth waiting for, sometimes. What was he doing? Exploring or what? I asked. Oh, yes, of course. He had discovered lots of villages, a lake, too. He did not know exactly in what direction. It was dangerous to inquire too much. But most of these expeditions had been for ivory. But he had no goods to trade with by that time, I objected. There's a good lot of cartridges left even yet, he answered, looking away. Cartridges are ammunition. To speak plainly, he raided the country, I said. He nodded. Not alone, surely. He muttered something about the villages round that lake. Kurtz got the tribe to follow him, did he? I suggested. He fidgeted a little. They adored him. The tone of these words was so extraordinary that I looked at him searchingly. It was curious to see his mingled eagerness and reluctance to speak of Kurtz. The man filled his life, occupied his thoughts, swayed his emotions. What can you expect, he burst out. He came to them with thunder and lightning, you know. And they'd never seen anything like it, and very terrible. He could be very terrible. You can't judge Mr. Kurtz as you would an ordinary man. No, no, no. Now, just to give you an idea, I don't mind telling you, he wanted to shoot me too one day. But I don't judge him. Shoot you, I cried. What for? Well, I had a small lot of ivory the chief of that village near my house gave me. You see, I used to shoot game for them. Well, he wanted it and wouldn't hear reason. He declared he would shoot me unless I gave him the ivory and then cleared out of the country, because he could do so and had a fancy for it, and there was nothing on earth to prevent him killing whom he jolly well pleased. And it was true, too. I gave him the ivory. What did I care? But I didn't clear out. No, I couldn't leave him. Had to be careful, of course, till we got friendly again for a time. He had his second illness then. Afterwards I had to keep out of the way, but I didn't mind. He was living for the most part in those villages on the lake. When he came down to the river, sometimes he would take to me, and sometimes it was better for me to be careful. This man suffered too much. He hated all this, and somehow he couldn't get away. When I had a chance, I begged him to try and leave while there was still time. I offered to go back with him, and he would say yes, and then he would remain, go off on another ivory hunt, disappear for weeks, forget himself amongst these people. Forget himself, you know. Why? He's mad, I protested. He protested indignantly. Mr. Kurtz couldn't be mad. If I had heard him talk only 2 days ago, I wouldn't dare hint at such a thing. I had taken up my binoculars while we talked, and was looking at the shore, sweeping the limit of the forest at each side and at the back of the house. So, number three, how does the Russian report that Kurtz spends his time? He says that Kurtz spends his time wandering in the forest and collecting ivory. And number 4, how does the tribe describe his feeling about Kurtz? And they adore him. Number 5, why did Kurtz threaten to shoot the Russian? He wanted to take his ivory. He wanted to have more ivory to send back to the company. Okay, going on. The consciousness of there being people in that bush, so silent, so quiet, as silent and quiet as the ruined house on the hill, made me uneasy. There was no sign on the face of nature of this amazing tale that was not as much told as suggested to me in desolate exclamations, completed by shrugs, and in interrupted phrases, in hints ending in deep sighs. The woods were unmoved, like a mask, heavy like the closed door of a prison. They looked with their air of hidden knowledge, of patient expectation, of unapproachable silence. The Russian was explaining to me that it was only lately that Mr. Kurtz had come down to the river, bringing along with him all the fighting men of that lake tribe. He had been absent for several months, getting himself adored, I suppose, and had come down unexpectedly with the intention of all appearance of making a raid either across the river or downstream. Evidently the appetite for more ivory had got the better of, what shall I say, less material aspirations, meaning his goal to civilize and kind of rehabilitate the Africans. However, he got much worse suddenly. I had heard he was lying helpless, and so I came up. Took my chance, said the Russian. Oh, he is bad, very bad. I directed my glass to the house. So how long has Kurtz been gone from the station this last time? He says he's been gone. He'd been absent for several months. Marlowe's looking through his spyglass. There were no signs of life, but there was the ruined roof, the long mud wall peeping above the grass, with the 3 little square window holes, no 2 of the same size. All of this brought within reach of my hand, as it were. And then I made a brusque movement, and one of the remaining posts of that vanished fence leaped up into the field of my glass. You remember I told you I had been struck at the distance by certain attempts at ornamentation, rather remarkable in the ruinous aspect of the place. Now I had suddenly a nearer view, and its first result was to make me throw my head back as if before a blow. Then I went carefully from post to post with my glass, and I saw my mistake. These round knobs were not ornamental but symbolic. They were expressive and puzzling, striking and disturbing. Food for thought, and also for vultures if there had been any looking down from the sky, but at all events for such ants as were industrious enough to ascend the pole. They would not have been even more impressive, these heads on stakes, if their faces had not been turned towards the house. Only one, the first I had made out, was facing my way. I was not so shocked as you may think. The start back I had given was really nothing but a movement of surprise. I had expected to see a knob of wood there, you know. I returned deliberately to the first I had seen, and there it was, black, dried, sunken, with closed eyelids, a head that seemed to sleep at the top of that pole, and with the shrunken, dry lips showing a narrow white line of the teeth, was smiling, too. smiling continuously at the endless and jocose dream of that eternal slumber. So number 7, what are the ornaments on the fence around the station house? Human heads. Yuck. I'm not disclosing any trade secrets. In fact, the manager said afterwards that Mr. Kurtz's methods had ruined the district. I have no opinion on that point, but I want you clearly to understand that there was nothing exactly profitable in those heads being there. They only showed that Mr. Kurtz lacked restraint in the gratification of his various lusts, that there was something wanting in him. Small matter, when the pressing need arose, could not be found under his magnificent eloquence. Whether he knew of this deficiency himself, I can't say. I think the knowledge came to him at last, only at the very last. But the wilderness had found him out early and had taken on him a terrible vengeance for the fantastic invasion. I think it had whispered to him things about himself which he did not know, things of which he had no conception till he took counsel with this great solitude, and the whisper had proved irresistibly fascinating. It echoed loudly with him because he was hollow at the core. I put down the glass, and the head that appeared near enough to be spoken to seemed at once to have leaped away from me into inaccessible distance. So how is Kurtz characterized due to the fence ornaments? They only show that Mr. Kurtz lacked restraint in the gratification of his various lusts. Basically, that he's gone savage. The admirer of Mr. Kurtz was a bit crestfallen. In a hurried, indistinct voice, he began to assure me he had not dared to take these, symbols down. He was not afraid of the natives. They would not stir till Mr. Kurtz gave the word. His ascendancy was extraordinary. The camps of these people surrounded the place, and the chiefs came every day to see him. They would crawl. I don't want to know anything of the ceremonies used when approaching Mr. Kurtz, I shouted. Curious, this feeling that came over me that such details would be more intolerable than those heads drawing on the stakes underneath Mr. Kurtz's windows. After all, that was only a savage sight, while I seemed at one bound to have been transported into some lightless region of subtle horrors, where pure, uncomplicated savagery was a positive relief, being something that had a right to exist, obviously, in the sunshine. The young man looked at me with surprise. I suppose it did not occur to him. I've lost my place, 1 second. That Mr. Kurtz was no idol of mine. He forgot I hadn't heard any of these splendid monologues on, what was it, on love, justice, conduct of life, or whatnot. If it had come crawling before Mr. Kurtz, he had crawled as much as the veriest savage of them all. I had no idea of the conditions, he said. These heads were the heads of rebels. What would rebel? I shocked him excessively by laughing. Rebels? What would be the next definition I was to hear? There had been enemies, criminals, workers, and these were rebels. Those rebellious heads looked very subdued to me on their sticks. You don't know how such a life tires a man like Kurtz, cried Kurtz's last disciple. Well, and you, I said? I am a simple man. I have no great thoughts. I want nothing from anybody. How can you compare me to? His feelings were too much for speech, and suddenly he broke down. I don't understand, he groaned. I've been doing my best to keep him alive, and that's enough. I've had no hand in this. I have no abilities. There hasn't been a drop of medicine or a mouthful of invalid food for months here. He was shamefully abandoned. A man like this with such ideas? Shamefully. I haven't slept for the last 10 nights. Okay, so the various terms Marlowe lists for the natives there, he says rebels, enemies, criminals, workers. How can they be rebels if they're following Kurtz like that? Okay, and the Russian is very upset because he's been taking good care of Kurtz this whole time with no food or anything. Okay, his voice lost itself in the calm of the evening. The long shadows of the forest had slipped downhill while we talked, had gone far beyond the ruined hovel, beyond the symbolic row of stakes. All this was in the gloom while we were down there were yet in the sunshine, and the stretch of the river abreast of the clearing glittered in a still and dazzling splendor, with a murky and overshadowed bend above and below. Not a living soul was seen on the shore. The bushes did not rustle. Suddenly, around the corner of the house, a group of men appeared, as though they had come up from the ground. They waded waist-deep in the grass in a compact body, bearing an improvised stretcher in their midst. Instantly, in the emptiness of the landscape, a cry arose whose shrillness pierced the still air like a sharp arrow flying straight to the very heart of the land. And as if by enchantment, streams of human beings, of naked human beings with spears in their hands, with bows, with shields, with wild glances and savage movements, were poured into the clearing by the dark-faced and pensive forest. The bushes shook, The grass swayed for a time, then everything stood still in attentive immobility. So, number 10, how does Kurtz arrive at the station? He's on a stretcher carried by native people. Now, if he does not say the right thing to them, we are all done for, said the Russian at my elbow. The knot of men with the stretcher had stopped too, halfway to the steamer, as if petrified. I saw the man on the stretcher sit up, lank and with an uplifted arm above the shoulders of the bearers. Let us hope that the man who can talk so well of love in general will find some particular reason to spare us this time, I said. I resented bitterly the absurd danger of our situation, as if to be at the mercy of that atrocious phantom had been a dishonoring necessity. I could not hear a sound, but through my glasses I saw the thin arm extended commandingly, the lower jaw moving, the eyes of that apparition shining darkly far in its bony head that nodded with grotesque jerks. Kurtz. Kurtz. That means short in German, don't it? Well, the name was as true as everything else in life, and death. He looked at least 7 feet long. His covering had fallen off, and his body emerged from it pitiful and as appalling as from a winding sheet. Do you need a simile example? That's a good simile example. As from a winding sheet is like what you wrap somebody in to bury them, like a shroud. And they're saying his body is emerging like it's from a shroud, so he's close to death. I could see the cage of his ribs all astir, the bones of his arm waving. It was as though an animated image of death carved out of old ivory had been shaking its hand with menaces at a motionless crowd of men made of dark and glittering bronze. I saw him open his mouth wide. It gave him a weirdly voracious aspect, as though he wanted to swallow all the air, all the earth, all the men before him. A deep voice reached me faintly. He must have been shouting. He fell back suddenly. The stretcher shook as the bearer staggered forward again, and almost at the same time I noticed the crowd of savages was vanishing without any perceptible movement of retreat, as if the forest that had ejected these beings so suddenly had drawn them in again as the breath is drawn in a long aspiration. Some of the pilgrims behind the stretcher carried his arms, 2 shotguns, a heavy rifle, and a light revolver carbine, the thunderbolts of that pitiful Jupiter. The manager bent over him, murmuring as he walked beside his head. They laid him down in one of the little cabins, just a room for a bed place and a camp stool or 2, you know. We had brought his belated correspondence, and a lot of torn envelopes and open letters littered his bed. His hand roamed feebly among these papers. I was struck by the fire of his eyes and the composed languor of his expression. It was not so much the exhaustion of disease. He did not seem in pain. The shadow looked satiated and calm, as though for the moment it had had its fill of all the emotions. So they put Kurtz on the boat. When it says they put him in one of the cabins, another name for a room on a boat is a cabin. So they're putting him on the boat when they say they put him in the cabins. He rustled one of the letters and looking straight at my face said, "I am glad. Somebody had been writing to him about me." These special recommendations were turning up again. The volume of his tone he emitted without effort, almost without the trouble of moving his lips, amazed me. A voice, a voice! It was grave, profound, vibrating, while the man did not seem capable of a whisper. However, he had enough strength in him, factitious no doubt, to make very nearly an end of us, as you shall hear directly. So Kurtz says, "I am glad," for number 12. He's saying he heard good things about Marlowe. Okay, we'll do part 2 in just a second.